it's pretty obvious that Benjamin Netanyahu has made his own calculations. He sees Biden as a lame duck. He believes now is his moment to try and neutralize the threat from Hezbollah, which is something which has preyed on Israeli decision makers, well, ever since 2006, really. And so, yes, he's taking advantage of what he perceives to be a leadership vacuum.
I'm joined by Mark Urban. Mark is here, as he is every Monday, to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Hello, Mark.
Good morning, Hugo.
Thanks very much for being with us, as always. Look, Mark, the big foreign news story is, of course, what's happening on the border between Israel and Lebanon. We've got Israeli tanks massing on the border. Would you say a ground invasion now looks inevitable?
No, I don't think it's inevitable, but it's clearly very possible. The Israelis have been almost sort of brandishing this prospect for some days. I think trying to get what they want out of this situation, which is effectively for Hezbollah to agree to cease fire and to step back from the Israeli border. But yes, the longer this goes on, the more the possibility is there that they will cross the border. Now, whether that's a full-scale assault like the one we saw way back in 1982, involving something like 80,000 Israeli soldiers, then I rather doubt that. There are far fewer than that on the border now. It might be something that involves raids or short-duration incursions. We don't know, but it's clearly possible. Even if I think they're not quite at the level of forces for a large-scale invasion.
The last time Israel sent troops into Lebanon was in, I think, 2006, wasn't it? It didn't go entirely well. Can you remind listeners what happened there?
No, it didn't. I mean, there was a series of, or an air campaign, a series of airstrikes, lots of targeting of Hezbollah, also some targeting of Lebanese civilian infrastructure. And then they did go in. I think it also was meant to be limited in its scope. They got ambushed quite a bit by Hezbollah. They lost some tanks. Clearly, Hezbollah painted it as a kind of massacre. I think that's perhaps going a bit far. But I think certainly the Israeli military emerged from that rather unhappy with the experience and determined to do things differently next time something like that happens.
And look, I mean, if the calculation is to sort of force a climb down from Hezbollah, to force them to stop firing rockets and to force them to sort of retreat from the border, is there a sort of bit of a paradox there in what appears to be the Israeli approach? Because, I mean, they've, in as much as we can understand, they've sort of decimated the leadership, if not destroyed the leadership. First with the pager attack, and then with various attacks since. And you kind of think, who are the figures in Hezbollah who are going to order such a retreat? Do they even still exist?
Well, I think there is the remnants of a leadership. The organisation has talked about appointing a successor to Hassan Nasrallah. I think it's possible. I think the bigger question is one to do with their will, their defiance, Iran's support, all of those questions, and indeed pressures from wider Lebanese society not to go on with this, because, of course, many people in Lebanon belonging to other groups really don't want this to go on. Those are the sort of operative factors. I don't think it's a sort of leadership vacuum that would stop this happening, if it's going to stop happening. I'm still, I think, big question as to whether the Israeli strategy will prove effective here. But if it does, well, it'll be, I think, because of a perception that the rest of Lebanese society is at best lukewarm about this confrontation, that Iran does not seem to be ready to up the ante in support of Hezbollah, having urged them to start firing these rockets in the first place from the 8th of October last year. That kind of sense that maybe now is the time to conserve what's left of the organisation, that would be the only calculation, I think, that would get them to enter into such an arrangement.
And Israel's operations, I think, yesterday or this morning in Yemen as well. Yemen being sort of quite far away, although of course the Yemenis, the Houthis particularly, were firing rockets towards Israel. Does that indicate that Israel, you expect, will be sort of conducting operations further and further afield, or is this a sort of a one-off warning shot?
Well, I think it's a response specifically to the fact that in the past 10 days, the Houthis fired 2 ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv. The actions that Israel has taken directly against the Houthis, against Yemen, seem to have been responses. There was a previous round of bombing when someone was killed in Tel Aviv by a drone. These ballistic missile firings seem to have been what triggered this. So I certainly think it's unlikely that the bombing of Yemen would become an everyday event now for the Israelis.
Yeah, sure. Joe Biden, he issued a last-minute appeal for restraint to both sides. But I don't know, I'm trying to sort of put this politely. Does anyone care what he says?
Well, it's pretty obvious that Benjamin Netanyahu has made his own calculations. He sees Biden as a lame duck. He believes now is his moment to try and neutralize the threat from Hezbollah, which is something which has preyed on Israeli decision makers, well, ever since 2006, really. And so, yes, he's taking advantage of what he perceives to be a leadership vacuum. But, you know, even if there was a more dynamic incumbent in the White House, I think there are big questions about how they could rein in the Israelis. For example, the obvious one that many people cite, well, stop sending them bombs. How easy is that for an American leader to do if Hezbollah and Iran then take advantage of that? It's very tricky for any American leader, I think, but particularly for one running out of steam like Joe Biden.
I mean, would you say as well, like Biden particularly, but any Israeli American president, do they actually want to rein in the Israelis at this point? Because I mean, there are groups all across the governments all across the Middle East who are about as hostile, really, towards both sort of Hezbollah and Hamas, and indeed Iran, as Israel is, who must all slightly be sort of, you know, talking out one side of their face while being slightly glad that somebody else is tackling this problem for them. And you wonder if an American president is kind of thinking, I would like Israel to stop, but maybe not yet.
Well, I think that's true. I think also in Western countries, what you're talking about speaks to a kind of disconnect between public opinion, which by and large has been pretty hostile to Israel in most European countries, if you look at the polling over the last year, and the opinion of security officials, the kind of elites that make policy, who do see things more in the terms that you've described, that Israel, for all its faults and for all the difficulties of controlling it, is opposed to Iran. Iran is opposed to Western interests, and therefore the question has to be, is my enemy's enemy my friend? And of course, Israel brings considerable military capabilities as well. If the US ever decides that military action is needed against Iran's nuclear program, for example, it would certainly be looking to the Israelis either for intelligence or more directly to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Mark, let's leap across the world as we so often do and go to Brussels, where Keir Starmer is there this week. Why is he going, and what's he going to be up to?
Well, I mean, this really is. There's a Brussels treble this week, actually. You've got the new Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, taking over tomorrow. Then you've got Keir Starmer there on Wednesday. Then you've got Yvette Cooper there on Thursday. Now, just to start with those last two first, this is the Labour government's reset with the EU agenda, clearly. And Keir Starmer is going to see the President of the Commission, European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, to start scoping out what's possible. We know that from the perspective of the EU, the big EU countries, particularly the Germans, the French, they want this youth mobility scheme. You know, they want students to be able to come to the UK visa-free and be able to, I beg your pardon, not under the old freedom of movement rules, but in order to come for a limited time in order to study. And of course, there would presumably be a reciprocal ability of UK students to go back to the EU countries to do that. That's what they want. It seems that Keir Starmer's not yet ready to go that far. The link seems to be that with immigration, precisely whether or not these visits should be subject to visas or how they should be regulated. And I guess you've also got some other questions about how the reset could take shape. I think a lot of people in the Labour government feel that making the flow of goods across the channel easier would be a good thing and a possible win. For example, by conforming to the EU's animal health regulations, a lot of stuff like meat, other products would flow much more freely with far fewer checks. So that's the sort of win thereafter. But I think the bigger question is about issues like movement of people, immigration, and that speaks to Yvette Cooper's agenda, which is to what extent can the EU and the UK harmonise new immigration agreements and cooperation agreements, which is connected, of course, to that question of people crossing the channel illegally.
From the perspective of European leaders, and particularly in Brussels, do they still regard that a reset is necessary, or do they think that kind of Keir Starmer is the reset and now we're just hammering out the details?
Well, this is an interesting one in the sense that I got the impression from European officials, if you'd asked them, say, a year ago, that they weren't particularly interested in the reset. They'd done the deal with the Johnson government, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and that has a formal process for review. And they really weren't going to change its terms in any meaningful way. They could try and make it work a bit more smoothly. We get back to that issue of customs rules and inspections and all that kind of thing. But they weren't going to change it in any fundamental way. But some of them did say to me, well, the only way we might consider that is if you had a government with a big majority, a very stable-looking government that wanted to renegotiate in a more fundamental way or try and find more fundamental ways. Now that there is such a government in position in the UK with a large majority, they don't seem to be saying that. It doesn't quite seem to be a wide open door. The messages from the EU, particularly the Commission, which is like the permanent civil service of the EU, the officials, seems to be, well, only a limited amount of change is really possible. And a couple of the governments, French and German, seem to be nudging them to move a bit faster. An example being the mobility scheme for students and youth. So exactly how far the EU is prepared to entertain meaningful change and how far Keir Starmer really wants to, because of course he said he's not going to renegotiate Brexit. Those are the big questions which I guess they're going to start getting to the heart of this week.
Sure. And look, finally, Mark, before I let you go, you touched on as well, there's the NATO aspect of his visits to Brussels as well. How important is that? And is that all about basically looking ahead to a future in which America perhaps is doing less for NATO?
Well, clearly that is a key aspect of it. If there's a Donald Trump victory in the elections in the US, that would make a massive difference to the Atlantic Alliance. I mean, given some of the things he said, you might argue that its central premise, which is that it's an organization that links the might of America with Europe, could be fundamentally undermined. The credibility of it could be fundamentally undermined. So yes, this new Dutch Secretary General has a big job on his hands. He is a convinced Atlanticist, i.e. someone who really believes in engaging the US and keeping it engaged. He's also got tensions, though, with the war in Ukraine, with the fact that some NATO members are pretty lukewarm about continuing to support Ukraine. They want to see some sort of ceasefire or other deal to stop it, whereas others like Poland, the Baltic republics, and indeed the UK are really, really determined not to abandon Ukraine at this particular moment and to keep going. And that's another tough job for him, I would say.